So what I wanted to do today is focus on chapters 21 through 23, which is the preface proper. But it's still connected to the archaeology because he ends the archaeology by contrasting past wars with this war, Houtos or Polemos, which he repeats 11 times in this section. And through that, he transitions to, since he doesn't separate his narrative of the war from the war, he doesn't have a separate word for his narrative. Simply the war itself consists of the speeches that he will include in his war, the actions that he will narrate in his war, and how each is determined and arrived at, and how accurate it can claim to be. And it also includes the audience that he expects for his war and who he does not want to be his audience and what he hopes his audience will get out of it. And finally, after a brief return to why the war is not only great, but also terrible, most great, but also most terrible, then he gets to his upcoming narrative and talks about the causes of the war and why he will highlight certain causes at the start. Okay, so all of that manages to be connected through this structure. And we have new key words here, by the way, but they're key words that occur just within a page and a half, so they're not widespread. Houtos hapolemos, which, as I say, is repeated in one form or another 11 times. And logoi, and the logoi in this case are not his accounts or certainly not his narrative, but the speeches that people deliver in his work, which are, I think you probably know, the most famous part of Thucydides, at least today they are. And the speeches, he doesn't write the speeches, people say the speeches according to him. His characters say the speeches. And then there's the erga, the actions in the war, which are not said by him, but he writes them. And all of these have these words, akribia, exactness, doke, which we've already seen as meaning it seems that, but what it especially means now is subjectivity. If something seems to me to be true, that means it's not necessarily true. It is my subjective opinion. Gnome, which appears to be a politician's policy, a politician's proposal for action. Ta deonta, which appears to be the course of action that needs to be followed. Akuein, which can mean either to listen to a speech, but it can also mean to hear a text, as we'll see. And so there is no word for read, as we'll say at this time. Akuo, since you listened to a text read, the word anagignosko, which means read later, was not any common use at this time. So akuo is a particularly treacherous word, but akuo in this section means what you hear versus what you're present at, what you hear about secondhand versus what you actually witness. He doesn't use the term eyewitness. He uses hearing versus being present. And then we have the words for causes here. And there are three deceptive words for cause. These are the false friends. Aitia, diaphora, and prophesis. Three very specific technical terms that he uses here in his chapter on causes, all of which have been taken to mean cause and none of which means cause. Aitia is one derivative of two from the word aitiaomai, which is ultimately from aitios. Aitios is the adjective meaning somebody is responsible for something. And so when you make the verb aitiaomai, that means you hold somebody responsible. And in a courtroom, that means you accuse them. You charge them with something. But it can also mean a thing that is responsible. So Thucydides chooses to use the word aitia for an accusation by somebody, and the word aition, the neuter of aitios, as the word for an impersonal root cause, which is not a subjective thing in court. A diaphora is a dispute. Diaphero means to be different. This is, in fact, a very, very strong word, stronger than difference in English, which comes from it. A diaphora is almost like a feud. And we should remember this, by the way, when Plato in the Republic calls of the age-old diaphora between philosophy and poetry. And he's using the word diaphora in the sense of a blood feud. In other words, they're not friendly rivals, philosophy and poetry. They're very strong enemies. And then prophasis, which usually means a pretext, something you say is your reason for action, but is not really. But ultimately, it just means your alleged reason for something. Phasis is from phemi, and pro means putting forward, what you say openly. And so this is your alleged reason for doing something. This relates to a cause, but it's not the same thing as a cause. It's what a particular party claims is its reason for action. There are two words for cause here, and that's these two, dihoti and ex hotu kateste. Those are neutral words for cause. Why, in other words, and on account of which it came to be. Those do refer to causes, but these other words do not. So these are all things that I believe strongly in, and I think I could persuade most other people of them, but I have not persuaded a lot of political science people, or I have not persuaded a lot of casual writers about Thucydides that these are true. So I think if you don't take these in the sense I take them, this sounds terribly arrogant, but if you don't, you just run into a lot of trouble. The opinions I hold most strongly about Greek literature are places where I have held the opposite opinion and corrected it. Maybe that's true for everybody. Your greatest convictions are those where you were your own opponent at one time. And I held all of these views at one time myself, these opposite views. So I'll be a little dogmatic. I'll try not to be too much, though. I think this structure, looking at the Greek really, rather than looking at a translation, makes more difference here than in any other part of Thucydides. So we'll start out. I just wanted to mention the end of the archaeology that we looked at last time. The archaeology has these four parts from the preceding Tecmeria. That's the way I think things are. And they are not, as the poets have said they are, and they are also not as the prose writers have composed them, but rather de, ute, and now de, but rather he would not be mistaken if he considers that they have been discovered, heorestai, from the clearest semeia, signs, not Tecmeria now, but its close synonym semeia, considering their antiquity, apochrontos, sufficiently. Okay, and now the past, but now Kai, he goes on, and is a very kind of weasel word for us. It doesn't seem to be a very strong word, but Thucydides uses it as a major structural marker. And you can only tell it's being a structural marker when it's repeated as the first word of a sentence many times over. And so, and this war, in other words, past wars are all this, what you should think. But here he transitions to this war meaning, first of all, the Peloponnesian War, simultaneously my narrative of the Peloponnesian War. They're the same thing. So now, this is the overall structure of the whole passage. And you'll notice, first of all, the magnitude of the war is just one sentence about this. This war, not only was the past war insignificant, but this war will show that it's the biggest. And second, and whatever they said in speeches in the war, and then this is the most controversial section, speeches versus actions. First, and then within this, there's further contrast. And as far as my audience goes, literally, and in relation to the hearing of it. In other words, by akroasis, he means the people who are going to hear my history, the audience. We use audience still. Audience technically means people who hear things, but we talk about the audience of a novel, the audience of a translation, things like that. It's not very precise, but we still do it. And that's what he's doing here. He's talking about his readership. And so that's the reception that he expects it to have. And then finally he gets away from the Kais, and he has this interruption, which is very embarrassing to me and to many others, where he says, and by the way, this war was terrible. It had a lot of suffering, and it had a lot of irrational events, and it was full of memorable catastrophes. And then he says, but again, he's still talking about this war. And there began this war, autou, that is this war, the Peloponnesians and Athenians began it, and now he's going to talk about the causes. The first causes to be narrated. And then he finally says, and so not the causes, but the accusations that they made against each other, in accordance with my principle I've just said, are the following. Haide. And then there's a break, and then he starts in a syndeton. I don't know if you're familiar with the term a syndeton. It sounds like it's very technical, but it's a very strong thing. It's when you begin a sentence without any particle or connection at all. And it's a very strong break. And there is no sentence connective in the beginning of his history proper. There once was a town called Epidamnus. It's almost as if you were to say once upon a time, and you signal to the listener or the reader that this is the beginning, and everything that went before is separate, and now you're starting a major narrative. And this is a lot easier to figure out because he's following Herodotus in the structure. So let me just jump ahead to this. Herodotus says, this is what the Persians and the Phoenicians say. You're probably familiar with this, the beginning of book 1, where he runs through, you know what he runs through? What are usually called the causes of the Persian War, but actually they're the accusations that the Persians and the Greeks make against each other. The accusations, you stole this woman from us. No, you stole this woman from us. Well, that was just retaliation for what you did because you did it earlier. And so after saying all those, this is what the Phoenicians and the Persians say, but I am not going to talk about these things in this way or that, how they happened. In other words, in any old way. But first, the man whom I myself know first began unjust deeds against the Greeks. After indicating this man, I will proceed forward in my narrative, going over alike small things and great cities of men. For what was long ago great, most of these things have become small. And what was great in my time was earlier small. So knowing that human happiness never stays in the same place, I will mention both of them equally. But he says, I'm going to mention the man first that I know started the Greeks. Kroisos ein, Asyndeton. There once was a man named Croesus. He was Lydian in family, the son of Alyattes, and the tyrant of the peoples, the ruler of the peoples who lived inside the river Halys. River Halys, which, and then he explains that. And then he goes down and below. Now this Croesus was the first of the barbarians of whom we know, who subdued some of the Greeks to, notice, esphoru apagogein, to the contribution of tribute. And some he made into friends. Okay, so this is how he starts, in a syndeton with Croesus. And what we have, like I said in Thucydides, he contrives to end his preface with the causes or the accusations. He's almost opposite, like from Herodotus in a way, because Herodotus begins with the accusations and said, that's neither here nor there. That's all preliminary for me. Now I'm going to switch to what I think, which is the first man and barbarian who contacted the Greeks and mistreated them. Whereas Thucydides has said in all his first part, this is what I think happened in previous human history. Now, I'm going to switch over and I'm going to talk about the accusations they made against each other. And I'm first going to say the following accusations. So in substance, he reverses the order, but formally, he does the same thing. He leads you up to a point and then said, now my history proper starts. And then he goes into a syndeton. And instead of for him Croesus, he talks about the little town which nobody had ever heard of at that time, called Epidamnus, and which never occurs again in the entire history. But Epidamnus got into a quarrel with Corcyra, and Corcyra got into a quarrel with Corinth, and Corinth got into a quarrel with Athens, and Athens got into a quarrel with Sparta, and that's how the war starts. It's an escalation of a very small local dispute. So that's the overall structure of this entire section. That's what he's aiming for in the end.